Well, if you thought that SOPA and PIPA were bad, just wait until you hear about cybersecurity legislation working its way through Congress. We reported to you on competing cybersecurity bills within the Senate, but there's a House bill that's already gained over 100 sponsors. That's perhaps the worst of them all. It's called CISPA, or the Cyber Intelligence Sharing and Protect Act, also known as H.R. 3523. And under the veil of doing things for cybersecurity purposes, it would allow companies to collect and monitor private communications and then share them with the government or anybody else. Here's a nightmare scenario that the EFF described. A company like Google, Facebook, Twitter, or AT&T could intercept your emails and text messages, send copies to one another and to the government, and modify those communications or prevent them from reaching their destination if it fits into their plan to stop cybersecurity threats. So, is it really as scary as it sounds? And what are the chances of stopping it? Well, joining me to discuss it is Trevor Tim, activist at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Trevor, thanks so much for joining us tonight. And so I just read that nightmare scenario that your organization, the EFF, put out there. You say that's true? Really? I mean, is this bill that bad?
Yeah, there are about 6 bills going through Congress right now, and the Rogers bill, which seems to be gaining the most steam, is probably the worst of the worst. You know, it purports to stop or prevent or defend against cyber threats by allowing private companies and governments to, share vital information that could help prevent it. But it's written so broadly that it ends up, like you said in the opener, allowing ISPs or email providers or social networks to spy on your internal communications as long as it's for, quote, a cybersecurity purpose. So what it does is it essentially carves out a cybersecurity exception to all of our privacy laws. And then once it gets to the government, all of this information, your communications, your private communications, we don't know exactly where it goes or what they're using it for. We don't know which agency it goes to or whether they're allowed to share between agencies, whether they're allowed to use this information for other than cybersecurity purposes like normal criminal investigations. And we know in the Rogers bill that the NSA is probably going to be one of the biggest benefactors. And while the NSA deals with cybersecurity threats, we've also heard many allegations that the NSA is spying on Americans. In fact, at EFF, we have a suit going on right now accusing them of just that. So this bill is very dangerous and doesn't actually solve the problems that it says it's supposed to.
Well, yeah, I mean, you guys aren't the only organization either that's out there speaking out about it. The Center for Democracy and Technology is also saying it. And they also mentioned that, although there's no specific agency that's mentioned within the government, probably the NSA or, the Pentagon Cyber Command are going to be the recipients here. But then if we have this question as to whether, if the information gets into the hands of the government, do they have to keep using it for cybersecurity purposes, whatever that means, or can they just start monitoring you? Does the bill have any restrictions, to at least help guide us in figuring out what exactly they can do once it's in their hands?
Right, that's the problem. There are no restrictions. And there are even definitions in there that could encompass things that you wouldn't even think are involved with cybersecurity. There is a provision in the Rogers bill, specifically the CISPA that we're talking about, that talks about misappropriated government information or intellectual property. And we fear that this clause hidden in the bill that nobody's really been paying attention to could end up being used to censor or block websites such as a whistleblower site like WikiLeaks, which the government obviously has not liked but can't shut down because it's protected by the First Amendment. The same thing goes with copyright infringement. The intellectual property clause may give the government a way or an excuse to censor websites that they think people are downloading music illegally off of. And the problem is that it's the hair trigger which allows these companies to kind of use cybersecurity purposes, whatever that means, to go after these people and hand the information over to the government. So you could essentially be encrypting your emails, might be an indicator, or using an anonymization service like Tor that allows you to hide where you are or hide your identity. So these are normal privacy tools that people should be able to use to, just keep their information private, but they're ending up as indicators of a cyber threat in this bill.
All right, but so see, within this interview already, both you and I have said cybersecurity purposes, whatever that is. And that's part of the problem too, right? Every time that we see, or not every time, but very often when we look at government legislation and there's a definition of something, it ends up being very broad, very vague. Yesterday on the show, we were talking about the NDAA and, what does it mean to be an associated force of Al-Qaeda? And so here we talk about cybersecurity purposes. Again, is this just a complete blanket statement?
Exactly. A few of these bills in Congress are actually narrower, and while they're not anywhere close to good, they actually do a better job of defining what a cybersecurity purpose is. And the problem is that the Rogers bill is purposely left vague, partly for the reason that this technology changes and you have to have some wiggle room. But again, we're talking about, we want to prevent major infrastructure damage. And what this bill allows the government to do is essentially use the threat of cybersecurity or, a cyber attack as an excuse to attack Americans' privacy.
And to read our emails, huh?
And exactly, to read our emails and even block websites. So that's what we want to make sure never happens.
Well, there's quite a bit of fear-mongering, involved in this, too. And if we just go back to the Senate version, as I mentioned, there was some competing legislation there. And so, let me just read you something that Senator Jay Rockefeller had said when they were discussing that bill. And he said, think about how many people could die if a cyber terrorist attacked our air traffic control system and planes slammed into one another, or if rail switching networks were hacked, causing trains carrying people or hazardous materials to derail and collide in the midst of some of our most populated urban areas like Chicago, New York, San Francisco, or Washington. So they make it sound very, very scary. But then if I read, some of the other tech blogs that I've read, like Tech Dirt, says that so far nobody in Congress has actually provided evidence that cybersecurity legislation of this nature really is, is needed.
Yeah, they can dream up these nightmare scenarios and try to scare people. But you're right, there's no studies or no empirical evidence that shows that this is a giant danger facing us all. And, and on the other hand, they bring up Anonymous, like Anonymous is some sort of terrorist group, and it's going to take down entire systems, when in fact mostly what they're doing is just DDoS attacks, which don't actually hack into any system at all. And so, again, those are covered under the bill as well. And it could prevent, and it allows these companies to actually block IP addresses before attacks occur. So it could essentially censor people from using the internet that may have no idea that they were either involved in a DDoS attack or that hadn't even committed one.
Let me ask you one last thing, too. Sorry, Trevor, because I got to wrap it up. We're running out of time. But unlike CISPA and PIPA, where we saw the major tech firms come out against that legislation, here, Microsoft, Facebook, Tech America, they're on board. How come?
Well, with CISPA and PIPA, their livelihood was threatened more directly, I think. They were going to have to censor so much content themselves, and there was going to be so much more legal liability put on them. So this situation is different, where obviously they want to be able to prevent, legitimate cybersecurity attacks, and they don't want to, stop the government from doing that. But what they end up doing is supporting bills that are way too broad and that could end up really hurting their users. And unfortunately, it hasn't been getting a lot of coverage, so not a lot of people know.
Yeah, well, it's definitely time to start talking about CISPA, considering that it already has 100 supporters in the House. And I guess I shouldn't be all that shocked that some legislation that really, threatens our privacy, Facebook might be behind. But Trevor, thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks a lot.